Understanding Safeguard Visualizations Using Balloons. This guide should help you at least use as an analog that doesn't require any technical background to understand, so that we can actually use it to understand how we look at these technical safeguards from CIS. All right, moving forward, what are the components of these safeguards? Well, one, we want to protect our balloons using safeguards. This is Juan's chibi from our book we wrote together called MSP Owner's Handbook, the Sassy edition with Juan and Marnie Stockman and Wes Spencer. But we need to establish and maintain a balloon inventory in this requirement. And if we look at the bottom, this is the safeguard title. This is word for word the actual title of the safeguard you'll find in CIS under the same name, title. The next piece we have is the safeguard description. This is actually saying that what we need to do in its kind of totality with some guidance. And what we'll find here, if we notice it's all highlighted in different colors, those are the different taxonomical elements that we talked about, that we started in this visual guide as we talked about this with you. The next thing we want to talk about is an actual visualization. So we made up 3 of these visualizations to walk through. The first one saying establish and maintain a balloon inventory. Establish and maintain an inventory of balloons in your organization. This list must document origin, inflation date, inflation gas, and decommission date. It also says review and update the balloon inventory biannually or more frequently. Okay, so let's talk about the pieces of this. We see this green element. That's the what of the safeguard, the core element, which is of this, have an inventory of all balloons, like inventory of all balloons, a balloon inventory. As we move forward, we start seeing the subcomponents of the safeguard, like what should be in that inventory or list. Well, maybe we should have these other components in there. We also see some of these boxes sometimes, and they usually mean it's a group of them. Those elements need to be taken together as an element. You need to satisfy all of them. They're an and statement, if you will. All right, and now we get into these orange elements that you see highlighted, and these are all kind of things that you could see done or observe, which means they could be proof or assessment statements, right? Things that are measurable or provable. Did you establish a list? Did you maintain that list as you change things? Did you review and update the inventory as time went on, right? I can look at that. And then must document. Did you get all of those things we talked about? All right, the next thing is conditional statements. You have or choices sometimes. Like in this case, review and update the balloon inventory biannually or more frequently, right? And so you have this option or a fork in the road in which you must make a decision. And so those will be in these elements that say or in a triangle. Okay, so the next thing we want to see is look at all these 4 components: balloon origin, initial inflation date, inflation gas, decommission date. Maybe they should be part of a list as we track and monitor these balloons, or maybe in an inventory, you might say. So if we take a look at this, we now see these columns being added to our inventory. We have balloon and the name or identifier of the balloon on the left. And then we have these columns we're tracking on the top for each of these rows: balloon origin, initial inflation date, inflation gas. Well, those come one for one from those safeguards that we just saw in the visualization. All right, so we're tracking it now. We've got our balloons. Let's fill it with some data. All right, blue balloon 1, 2, those are all helium balloons, those first 4, and then there's a couple of hydrogen balloons from various origins: Walhut, Targut, iMart, overseas manufacturer, right? Things to that nature. So we're tracking these elements. This is part of this inventory of balloons that we have in Juan's hand here. All right, let's move forward. At 1.2, it says we must classify balloons, establish and maintain a balloon classification process, included the minimum size, shape, and maliciousness. Examples of malicious balloons, they're giving us exemplary things, right? It's are containing hydrogen, spy equipment, maybe located in street drains with clowns. Those are malicious balloons, and we want to identify them. Review the balloon inventory and classification monthly or more frequently. These down here, these dark trapezoids, are the overall exemplary language, meaning like, examples of malicious balloons is this overall categorization. And then underneath that, we find these subcomponents in this case, or, examples given, like balloons containing hydrogen or spy equipment. And this other side, located in street drains with clowns. And so we're just seeing this visualization of the breakdown of the words, but letting you know that they were all examples, which means you don't necessarily have to do any of these. It could be other things you might deem as malicious. These might be part of them and likely are, but there could be other things. And so these are exemplary in that definition. You might ask yourself, what are these like green circles here tied in and these like lines that are, maybe dashed and all that? And so when we want to answer that, we look at how they're actually inverse of each other. So if we look back, we have 1.1 from 1.2, and over here we have 1.2 from 1.1. And what it's trying to show is the relationship and interdependence. And these are interdependent safeguards that depend upon each other, whether it be for parameterization or data, as we'll start to explain further. Think of a parameter in this case. A parameter changes the safeguard being pointed to. So in this case, our balloon classification process adds some columns over to our inventory of all balloons. Which columns? Size, shape, maliciousness, all those things called out in that yellow in that 1.2. Now, as we see this, we also, as we're trying to execute 1.2, we might have to read, right, and put data across as we're saying, listen, we just classified, we got the size, the shape, the maliciousness of each of these balloons over to this inventory of 1.1 of those balloons. We're now adding some classification information and columns to that. What does it mean when you see bidirectional arrows? Well, bidirectional arrows means we're pulling data back and forth. Think back in that example we just talked about, right? And same thing with parameters. Maybe I'm actually setting a parameter in this one and in the other one bidirectionally in some cases that we'll see in the visualizations. Or when we have data dependent, such as the one we just said, where I'm reading from 1.1 each balloon, figuring out its classification and writing back that classification back to that list. And so you're seeing bidirectional data flow. All right, in this case, when 1.1 might need columns in a table from 1.2, and so we're seeing this parameter line going towards 1.1. We also see to execute this control, we'd have to read from 1.1, so we see this line coming towards 1.2. And as we go further, we'd have to write back to 1.1 as we classify things, and we start to determine whether they're malicious or whether they have a certain size or shape and those natures. Okay, well, 1.2 modifies 1.1 and depends on data from and feeds 1.1. So this is one of those understandings of the interdependency as a definition. And as we see this, we've added more columns from 1.2, size classification, shape classification, maliciousness. And as we go through, we're going to start populating those columns, medium size, raindrop classification, shape. And then ultimately we have a couple that, because of their nature of reading this data about them having hydrogen gas in them and seeing that our classification included hydrogen as malicious, we now had to codify these two balloons, red balloon 1 and red balloon 2, as malicious balloons, right? So we're seeing that now in our column, and we're going to see that play out because of this, then that. And so this is why these are interdependent. You have to read from them, you're getting information, you're classifying and writing back in that statement. All right, 1.3 says, as we go in with this, interdependency again, 1.3 goes on to say we need to pop malicious balloons. Ensure that all malicious balloons are either popped with a balloon popping tool, so we see this represented, or receives a documented exception, right? This is kind of this understanding that sometimes you have to keep the red balloons around or the malicious balloons around, right? And so we have to understand that sometimes it needs a documented exception. And then we see this language, do not use atmospheric pressure reduction due to elevation as a means of popping balloons, as it provides no control of waste balloon materials. Review malicious balloon process monthly or more frequently. And we see this represented down here as octagons that mean do not, right? That when we see this in a safeguard, it's telling you don't do this, and you have to be able to see that you haven't done that, especially if it's measurable. It comes down to also somewhat of a proof statement, but it's basically giving you guidance saying don't do this, this is bad. Also, we see this going forward of this specific tool, like a popping tool. Well, we see that here as a needle represented with the hand, right? That's our popping tool. So it's a specifically called out tool when you see a blue triangle. Going forward, we also see that because of 1.3, we had to add more columns into our spreadsheet, decommission date and documented exception. Now we see that because we're in 1.3 and we're trying to execute it, we're going to read from this list and we're going to see which ones are malicious, these two at the bottom, the red balloons, and we're going to apply our popping tool to those to pop them. But we cannot forget that we also must document those decommission dates, right? We have to write down when those were pulled out of action, when we're no longer using those balloons. And essentially, this has been our example of how to walk through these safeguards and in this community project. Please go ahead and move forward to looking at the real safeguards. And I hope you've gotten some better information. You'll find that this video directly represents in the alignment, you'll see them hopefully, the safeguards in the rule book that's attached.